They started from the south side and attacked the city and the villages. In that early morning, every single security person that was tasked and responsible for the security of the region ran away. All of them without any exception.
That's Abid Shamdeen describing the events surrounding the tragic attack by ISIS on the Yazidi people in the Sinjar region of Iraq, which took the lives of over 5,000 people, with thousands more missing, many of which are presumed to be still in captivity. Abid was born and raised in Sinjar, Iraq. For the past 6 years, he's advocated for victims of the Yazidi genocide and has managed projects that have brought aid and assistance to internally displaced Yazidis in Iraq. During the United States-led invasion of Iraq, he worked for the U.S. Army as a translator and cultural advisor. Abid holds a master's degree in political science from the School of International Service at American University. Together with Nobel Peace Prize recipient Nadia Murad, Abid co-founded Nadia's initiative, whose mission is to create a world where women are able to live peacefully and communities that have experienced trauma and suffering are supported and redeveloped. I'm your host, Warren Hoffman, and in this episode of Conflict, Power, and Persuasion, Abid describes the genocide of the Yazidi people. He not only speaks specifically of the plight of the Yazidi, including their history, the process which made the Yazidi vulnerable to an attack by ISIS, as well as detailing the aftermath of the Sinjar Massacre, but in doing so, he also provides invaluable insights into the risks of interventionism in politically disputed regions, as well as important considerations required to successfully rebuild and reintegrate minority groups in the wake of genocide or humanitarian crisis.
This is Conflict, Power, and Persuasion, podcast of the Canadian International Institute of Applied Negotiation.
Hi, Abid. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and very happy to join you for this discussion.
It's great to meet you. Can you tell us a bit about your background?
Of course. I grew up in Sinjar, in the Sinjar region north of Mount Sinjar, to a big family. I have seven siblings. We grew up in a small, well, not small, decent size village. It's a collective that was created essentially by the Saddam's regime. My family, my grandfather, and our extended family lived near the foothill of the mountain prior to 1975. But after that, like most Yazidis, they were forced to move further from the mountain and put them in what's so-called collectives. They're not villages; they're smaller towns. I believe at the time, in 2010, when I left Iraq, our collective was about 30,000 people or so.
So I understand a bit about the region. The community has been positioned around Mount Sinjar for quite some time. Maybe you can tell us a bit about the region as well, and the history of the region and what it was like to grow up there.
Of course, yeah. So historically, Yazidis have been in Iraq. The majority of the Yazidi community in Iraq has been located around the Mount Sinjar and inside the mountain area, both north and south. And it's right on the Syrian border. But there are also Yazidis in Iraq at different locations, in Nineveh Plain, in Bashira, where there is a Yazidi community there. There are also Yazidi villages in the Dahuk region of the far north of Kurdistan region. But the majority of Yazidis in Iraq, especially, have always lived around Mount Sinjar region. It's a mountainous region. At least when I was a child, when I grew up there, it was green. People have always mostly dependent on farming and raising cattle as a way of making a living because of the historic, I should say, discrimination against Yazidis in terms of access to education, but also access to resources and other opportunities. when people depended on farming and raising cattle to make a living in that region. But the nature of that region has somewhat changed since then, because of the droughts, because of conflict as well that devastated the region.
Maybe we can back up a bit. So the Yazidi people, this is a distinct culture. Can you tell us a bit about the history of the Yazidi people?
Yeah, so Yazidis are a ethno-religious minority, a small, well, at least now a small community, but to be honest with you, much of the Kurdish region historically were Yazidis. I think throughout different campaigns, Yazidis were forced to convert. And even in Turkey, I mean, Yazidis existed historically in parts of Turkey, in Syria, in Iraq, and other places, but through different campaigns of violence and forced conversions. The numbers are now much smaller. I believe the number of Yazidis in Turkey are probably close to non-existent at the moment. The numbers in Syria have declined, and as you can see, since 2014, well, since 2003, after the U.S. Invasion, because of the violence that increased against Yazidis by radical Islamist groups. Since that invasion, Yazidis have tried to immigrate, but thousands of Yazidis in 2007, but then also in 2014, were killed by campaigns of violence by ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other groups. But Yazidis, as a small religious minority, we have our own religion and our own culture and our own identity. And this is one of the issues, I think, misconceptions about, are Yazidis Kurds, are Yazidis Arabs, are Yazidis this? Yazidis are not either of these. Yazidis are Yazidis. And for me, at least as a Yazidi, and consider Yazidism first of all as an identity, as a cultural identity for me, as something I relate to, and obviously it's our, contains our religious beliefs as well. But we have our own religious holidays. We have our own cultural holidays, or even our own New Year that comes up at a different time of the year than compared to other groups in the region. And we have, to be honest with you, as I said, in at least from what we know, and these things have been passed on orally. Our religion has been oral for many reasons, as we understand, because people were not able to practice publicly because they were afraid of documenting everything. But also, even the history of violence against Yazidis have not been documented very well in the past, prior to the 2014 genocide against Yazidis.
I want to get into that in a moment. But just a bit more on the history here. So how many years we're going back here? And is it sort of, was it the region around Mount Sinjar that sort of isolated the Yazidi people, that sort of allowed them to adopt their own culture and religion and whatnot? Is that well documented, or is it just sort of?
Yes, that's another issue. Is I think even the documentation that is available, unfortunately, it contains a lot of misinformation. And in the early 1900s, there were campaigns of violence against Yazidis, and we believe that a lot of Yazidis that are currently in the Sinjar mountain, some of them at least, fled from parts of Turkey in the Kurdistan region of Iraq to take refuge in Mount Sinjar, again, even at that time, to hide from violence and to take cover there. And that's why the population was concentrated around the mountain, in the foothill of the mountain. But again, after different regimes in Iraq, and as brutal as the Saddam's regime was and forced Yazidis to relocate, That's, to be honest with you, where Yazidis a bit were able to kind of live away from the mountain sometimes. There was discrimination. There was a deliberate campaign of resource deprivation, but there were no organized campaigns of violence like we saw with ISIS or in 2007 or in the past during the time of the Saddam's regime.
Mm.
Uh,
So
we saw the peak of violence. We saw violence against Yazidis peak significantly after 2003.
Saddam's regime, the creation of collectives. Can you talk more about that? What was his objective there, as far as you know, and what did that look like?
Well, from what I understand, is the objective was for easy control, but also to make sure there was no chance of any opposition that can be formed in the mountain and can provide no refuge for anyone who was going against the regime. And from what we understand is that because the end of Mount Sinjar, it touches kind of the Syrian border, and I think there were fears of connection to that country or even the Kurds there or so forth. But it was mainly to control the population easier and put them in these collectives. And he also, like regimes after him, set up a patronage system in that region, and even brought in, for example, government officials and security officials that were foreign to the region from other parts of the country that can rule over the population, but also recruited, to be honest with you, and set up that patronage system of a group of Yazidis that were also working with the regime, that were feeding information and also helping the regime and those officials that were brought in to control the population and have that easy control over the region.
Just before we get to the 2014 events there, curious, after Saddam was out of power, did the Yazidis move back, sort of dissolve those collectives and move back to the region, or?
No, not really, because people lived there for decades. He was in power for a few decades, and people already had their homes and their neighbors and their connections, and each of these collectives, as I remember from where I lived in that collective, there were a few schools, one clinic, in terms of services. Basically, those were it. And to go to a village that didn't have a school at all or a clinic at all, it was difficult. But it was also, lack of resources for people to go and start over again.
Mm.
So people stayed sort of in those same settings.
Mm. Was it generally a safe place to grow up, would you say, or?
It was generally a safe place to grow up when I was there, when I grew up there. But it got more and more dangerous after 2003, after the US invasion, like I mentioned earlier, and the rise in radical Islamist groups that targeted Yazidis and other religious minorities systematically. But, going back to the regime, it was safe there if you were quiet, if you didn't say a word about the regime, if you didn't complain about the lack of services, if you didn't oppose any of the policies that were very oppressive against people there. So basically, you had to say nothing and live in that environment that lacked the very basic human rights to access to services and education and things like that. But yes, Yazidis, were able to travel all over Iraq. For example, I think my father at the time, who was mandatory military service that everyone had to serve, and was traveling throughout parts of Iraq, and it was safe for him. But also worked as a truck driver for many years in different parts of Iraq that it was safe for him to travel. And so Yazidis were not being targeted based on identity at the time, which that was the main difference between then and post regime.
When the U.S. invasion started, how did that change things? What were the implications for the Yazidi?
Yeah, so that changed our lives significantly, to be honest with you. Right after the fall of the regime, the Kurdish government, the so-called KRG now, took over the region and brought in their security. There was opposition from some Yazidis, but there were also were not able to entirely oppose it. And that's what created many of the issues that we're now facing in terms of after the formation of the Iraqi constitution, our region fell under the so-called Article 140 of the Iraqi constitution that references some areas in Iraq as disputed areas. And the Sinjar is one of those so-called disputed areas. And after 2003, the control of local governance and security arrangements in Sinjar were slowly from 2003 up until 2007 and in 2014 became 95% under the Kurdish government. It meant it was supposed to be joint control, at least from a security perspective, but the majority of the security control was under the Kurdish government. And I worked, there as a cultural advisor, as a translator, and in fact, I was involved in some of the processes of the so-called joint security mechanism that was set up in the region, where you had joint security checkpoints of both the Iraqi army, police, and the Peshmerga. But those obviously didn't work out very well, as we can see from the events of the 2014.
Let's move to that now. But I'd like to come back to the cultural advisor piece. But can you talk then about the Sinjar massacre, the sort of the events leading up to it, and if you would?
Yes. So this is another thing, is that the region and the Yazidis were not known to the outside world, and you probably, many people did not even hear about Yazidis prior to 2014, to be honest with you. It was a small group, but the problems did not start suddenly in 2014. It was not just something that happened. It was a process of misinformation, started even during the Saddam's regime, but people were quiet about it because they feared the regime to voice any violence against Yazidis at the time because of the regime that was faith-based because of our religion. But it continued on, and it grew much and much bigger after the invasion, the US invasion of 2003. There was a significant rise, as you know, in activities of terrorist groups and radical Islamist groups in the region. I know when I worked for the military, there were called different names, Jihad and Tawheed and Al-Qaeda and others. But eventually they were the same people and ended up calling themselves ISIS at some point. But it started long before 2014 with a campaign of misinformation, hate speech, also resource deprivation, and as I mentioned, both under the previous regime and after 2003, exclusion of local people, not just Yazidis, the inclusion of the people in the region having a say in their own affairs in terms of local governance, in terms of security control, in terms of making decisions about their own regions, that it was all in the hands of people who were foreign to the region that were brought in under both regimes to control and to run the region. And so it was a process that started long before 2014 with these different elements, but also, as I mentioned, the idea of resource deprivation, where you have a community that generations have grown up without access to proper education, without higher education access. There is, to this day, there is no university or college in that region, and not having a say in your own security always puts you and your region at risk. And there were, prior to 2014, for example, in 2007, there was a major attack against the south side of Yazidi region, south side of Mount Sinjar, that targeted a few of the collectives that I mentioned with explosive trucks and killed hundreds of people, and thousands were injured. And one of the collective's sub-districts, most of the village was leveled to the ground, and hundreds of people were killed. And that was one of the major attacks in 2007, August 14th of 2007.
Who was behind that attack?
It was terrorist groups. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Al-Qaeda claimed it, maybe, or other radical groups in the region. But
and this is just targeting Yazidis based on what you're saying is the
based on religion.
Okay.
And at the time, I was working with the military, and the U.S. military went to the site of what happened, and yes, the trucks were loaded with explosives, and in that sub-district, from what we heard from the community there, in the aftermath, those that survived, they called people and said they knew it was an impoverished region and people were in need and support. They said, these are trucks of aid. They're here to to distribute aid, and people just gathered around these trucks, and they set them off. And from 2003 up until that major attack in 2007, and then beyond 2007, the campaign of violence continued based on identity, and people knew based, when you check the Iraqi ID, it says what religion you are, but also those Yazidis from the other regions that I mentioned earlier, from Bashira, that were going to work in Mosul or study there, and from other regions where many people were stopped at these checkpoints and killed by these different terrorist groups, including a group of Yazidi men that went to Baghdad, and they were part of the Iraqi military going back to their unit to work, and including my uncle was among that group that till this day we have not found even their remains. They disappeared. When they enter Baghdad, we knew they enter Baghdad to cross Baghdad and to go to their unit, but we have never heard anything else about what happened to them. And so it started long before 2014, and the environment was created. And when ISIS attacked, they knew this. They knew that the conditions were right for this attack, because we were not in charge of our own security, of our own governance. We didn't have the resources to defend ourselves. And geographically also, it was difficult for us to move anywhere to escape. And so the only refuge was Mount Sinjar. And so ISIS, after taking Mosul and some of these other parts that surrounded Sinjar region, they planned it very well. In August 3rd, early morning, they started their campaign of attacking the Yazidis. They started from the south side and attacked the city and the villages on the south. And in that early morning, every single security person that was tasked and responsible for the security of the region ran away. All of them, without any exception. As I said in my, in our earlier discussion, there was that joint security mechanism that was set up with the support of the coalitions or the U.S. military. So, especially in the South side, you had the presence of the Iraqi military, you had the presence of police units, federal police units, but the majority of the security was at the hands of the Kurdish Peshmerga at the time. And all of these combined units, all of them ran away. In fact, we don't even know what happened to the weapons that all of these different groups had. Perhaps some of them ended up with ISIS, but others were even taken. And so what happened is that just local Yazidis, men and women, tried with their own weapons that they had. Some of them tried to hold ISIS off, especially in the south side. Tens of Yazidis were actually killed in the early morning when ISIS attacked, because they tried to hold them off until at least the women and children were able to make it to Mount Sinjar, and they did. And tens of Yazidis bravely sacrificed their lives to defend the vulnerable, the women and children, and the elderly, until the majority of them were able to make it to the mountain. But unfortunately, because it was right at the middle of the summer, and it's really hot in that region. Right now, it's probably like 110, 15 degrees, and I think that's 45 or close to 50 Celsius. And people were not prepared. They just were confused and shocked. They just ran on foot. They got on their cars, and so some of the disabled were left behind, to be honest with you, because people had no choice. Some of the elderly, some of the children died on their way to the mountain because of thirst, and it was really hot, and there is no. It's the only water that is available in the region is groundwater, and there wasn't enough water for everybody, and it was very chaotic, and people were shocked and didn't know what was happening. But everyone tried to make it to the mountain, but close to 5,000, at least those of we know of, were killed in the early morning hours of August 3rd, while people were trying to flee. And obviously, as you know, more than 6,000 were taken into captivity, mostly women and children, during that attack. And they not only focused on humans destroying the community, they also focused on the livelihoods and the property that Yazidis had, in terms of a region that depended on farming for generations, destroyed the farming system there and looted everything, people's properties, the schools that existed, and the clinics and the hospitals and everything that was in the region in their way. It was looted, and the buildings were destroyed.
So that's 5,000 in just a few hours.
Innocent people that were under the impression that we are being protected. There is someone to defend us, and at least, and without any warning, left, and they were put in that situation, an easy target for ISIS to conquer.
And 6,000 into captivity. Is it a good time to switch into Nadia's initiative in your current work?
Well, I think before we get to that, if you don't mind, I think it's good to also mention the current situation.
Yes.
All of that happened. For example, yes, when we think about what happened during the early days of the genocide, 6,500, 5,000 people killed and homes destroyed. These are all statistics, but these are also families. These are also people. These are also human beings. Stories of real people like you and me, and people who had families, who had communities, who had farms, who had cattle. And, there were communities like, Nadia's community and her village that were far away from the village, that didn't even have a chance to escape. And so the entire village, which included 1,700 plus people, was captured and was under siege for 2 weeks. And in the early days, I remember when I came to Washington, I was in college, my last semester at UNL, University of Lincoln, in Nebraska, and with a group of other Yazidis, my friends, who we served together with the U.S. military, and other connections that we made from the Yazidi community, and also Canada. People came from different parts of U.S. and Canada, and we tried everything to find a way to get aid and someone to help as much as possible. There were limited airstrikes, thankfully, at least by the U.S. at the time, that enabled tens of thousands of people to have a chance to escape from the mountain then to where Yazidis are now in the Kurdistan region. But we failed, obviously, to help Nadia and her village, and a few other villages like hers that were under siege, at least for 2 weeks. And ISIS gave them no choice but to convert or die. And at the end, they were gathered and separated, and women and kids were taken into captivity to be used for sexual slavery, but men were killed in mass graves. Today, the United Nations investigative team that Nadia helped create, working with UN member states for almost 2 years, through her advocacy with her lawyer, Mal Clooney, that is now tasked with collecting evidence and compiling testimonies and making sure that all the evidence is preserved. As so far, they have been able to discover 86 mass graves throughout Sinjar. Most of them not even exhumed yet. But from those that were taken into captivity, more than 2,500. We don't know the exact numbers, to be honest with you, but we know from the data that we have collected in Nadia's initiative over the past 6 months and over the past few years, that over 2,000 at least are still missing somewhere in captivity. The destruction that ISIS left behind, aside from the human cost and the suffering of the people, it was devastating because they not only looted and took cattle and property of people and everything that people left behind and destroyed the homes and the schools and the clinics, they also filled the region with mines, explosives. And so it was quite a task to figure out, how do we start after the region was liberated. Obviously, start with anything and do anything, you had to demine the region, because it was dangerous for us and for others to go and for people to return. So we worked on that for quite a while with the U.S. State Department and others, to convince them to shift some resources and get the region demined. It's been demined mostly, but there are still villages that need demining.
Let's back up for a minute. You're the ED of Nadia's initiative, and Nadia, as you mentioned, was in a village or a collective away from the south that was in the fighting. They didn't have time to escape, and they spent 2 weeks being under siege. Let's start with a bit more on Nadia, and then the creation of Nadia's initiative, so we can start there.
Of course, yes. Obviously, Nadia herself, as a survivor and as a phenomenal human being who has used her story and used her experience to help not only her community but also others, and to convey a message about the need for prevention and the idea of never again, and has worked tirelessly to promote the idea of we talk about never again, but we fail to prevent. And losing her mother, ISIS, killed her mother as someone who was innocent, as a human being that has never harmed any person, but were killed, and her brothers and nieces and family members and neighbors and friends, for no reason other than just being Yazidi and than being different from them. And that's the story of many Yazidis that were killed by ISIS, thousands of people. And so her surviving all of that and losing family members, and then after survival, and as Nadia mentions all the time, living in one of the displacement camps in the region, she saw all of the process firsthand and experienced it herself with her family. And after moving to Germany to get support there, but even before moving there in the camps, she decided to share her story and to use her story to dispose the evil of ISIS and the evil that ISIS wanted to spread in the region, and how they harm people and enslave and rape women and children. And the idea of forming Nadia's initiative, entirely Nadia's idea, based on, okay, all of this happened when the initiative focuses on accountability. And as I mentioned earlier, worked with UN member states and Amal Clooney to create UNITAD, the United Nations special investigative team that is tasked with collecting evidence. Their mandate is specifically to collect evidence of crimes ISIS committed, not only in Sinjar, and not only against Yazidis, but in Iraq as a whole, because accountability and justice is very important to her. And collecting that evidence is critical to hopefully trials that will take place at some point. It's been 8 years, as you know, and very few trials have taken place, if any. And so the idea of holding perpetrators accountable and holding ISIS accountable was one of the main points that Nadia's initiative wanted to work on. And the other, obviously, was advocacy in general around the topic of, because it's a topic that is close to Nadia and what she's experienced, especially holding ISIS accountable and groups like them for crimes of sexual violence against women, and advocating for accountability in general around that topic, and also prevention. And the other is also, obviously, if you visit Nadia's initiative.org, is the work we are doing in Sinjar, specifically around creating that environment for the community to be able to survive, but also thrive and return home. Restoring schools, we focused heavily on education, because it's difficult for families to make that decision going from the camps if there is no school for their children when they return to one of the collectives, to one of the villages. And so we focused on trying to restore the school system in the region with our partners, with our friends there in the region and globally. and slowly we have, been making progress in terms of rehabilitating and even building brand new schools in some of the villages that never had a school in that village, equipping and even, expanding. And for example, some of the schools that we've rehabilitated never had a school library, so we've been able to add school libraries to some of these schools that we've been to rebuild and build new ones that contain libraries, put thousands of books there for the students to be able to have access to these books, equipping their schools and making sure they have access to wash and sanitation in some of these schools. But obviously, as a small organization, it's this task is not we cannot do it on our own, and that's why we in our work we focus on encouraging others to also shift focus there and help us and join us to work on these different sectors, and also helping survivors of sexual violence with interim reparations, with small businesses so that they can go and rebuild their lives and recover, connecting more than 18 villages to clean water, rebuilding some of the clinics that were destroyed and equipping them, farms. One of the most important things is that, as I said earlier, farming system was one of the most crucial things in the region because people depended on farming to survive and to make a living. And Nadia grew up on a farm herself with her family. If you read her book, The Last Girl, where she, details her experience in her life on that farm with her family. And so we've restored hundreds of farms to enable families to go back and farm again. Nadia is building a school, a hospital. A brand new hospital in Sinjar, in partnership with the French government, so that the community in the region, not just Yazidis but others, can have access to critical life-saving healthcare services, and especially for survivors of sexual violence to have that access to a new hospital, a medical center, so that people they do not have to travel hours and hours to go to get healthcare. And so these different sections that we worked on, we call it a holistic approach, bottom up, working with the community. With our team is from the region. We do these projects in consultation, and we hold regular workshops with community members to see what they think, what are their priorities, and to work with them hand in hand to create with them some of these projects, and especially survivors. And so different sectors that we're trying to focus on public services, because the problem is, after ISIS was driven out and defeated from and the area was liberated, it has again unfortunately been neglected by our government in Iraq, and they have not invested in rehabilitating some of these sectors, but also have neglected both security and governance in that region. So we think it's not possible to wait another 8 years. We advocate obviously with the international community to try and get them to pressure the Iraqi and the Kurdish government to do more and to do better, but meanwhile also trying everything we can to rehabilitate some of these different sectors so that people can go back home.
Wow, very busy, lots of positive on the ground activities with immediate benefits and creating a positive impact there. And as you said, it's sort of a holistic across the board approach, even with the bigger activity, the more longer term one with working with Emil Clooney for creating that the accountability, which is quite a lofty undertaking, an important one as well. You've mentioned sexual violence a number of times. Can you describe what you feel is the relationship between sexual violence and genocide?
Yeah, well, I'm telling you this from my experience in the past few years working at Nadia's initiative and doing advocacy on that issue, and also on, helping the Yazidi community. And from my personal perspective, from what I've noticed, is that especially ISIS, and I mean many other groups, and even these are non-state actors, but they're also state actors at this, also using sexual violence as a tactic of war, using sexual violence. ISIS, if we, go back to what ISIS did with Yazidi women, it was not only to enslave the women, but also use them to attract fighters, to attract foreign fighters, especially and other fighters from the region. And they gifted them human beings, Yazidi women, and there were organized markets, both in person and online, in ISIS held territories, and used those women, and sold them to one another. And after ISIS was slowly getting defeated, and they started asking for ransoms, like from Yazidi families, and hundreds of Yazidi families have had to collect money and raise money to rescue their family members, paying tens of thousands of dollars in ransoms to rescue family members. But there are many families that obviously cannot afford that. And that is also one of the reasons that we still have more than 2,500 in captivity. So to answer your question, yes, there is a connection, and unfortunately, the connection is that it is one of the main tactics to destroy the Yazidi community by enslaving women and using sexual violence against the community to destroy the community.
Can you give an update then on the Sinjar victims today? What's
The population as a whole?
Yeah, please.
Of course, yes. So in the in the early days of the genocide, almost the entire population of Sinjar was either killed or forced to displace. But some people stayed in the region inside the mountain and took cover in the mountain. And some families, to be honest with you, never left the region. And some Yazidi fighters stayed in the mountain, and that's, ISIS was never able to take the control of the mountain. They had control of all the land surrounding it, but they were not able to get inside the mountain. And after the region was liberated, unfortunately, because of these so-called disputed area arrangement, and because other actors also entered the region, the stability, the security, stability, and the local governance stability has prevented people from returning to a certain extent. One of the main barriers to return. But because of the work we're doing, and some of our partners are doing on the ground, more than 150,000 people have been able to return to the region in Sinjar. But still, about 55 to 60% of the population is displaced, living in the displacement camps. And this is one of the main challenges we have, to be honest with you, is that the international community, the aid and the support that is going, has been poured into these camps for 8 years. And all of these, arrangements, all of this investment is temporary. It's all of it is helping feed that environment that is keeping Yazidis trapped and victimized again in these displacement camps, because they were at least meant to be temporary, but 8 years is not temporary.
Yeah.
But we are doing everything we can to focus on long-term sustainable solutions, and that's why we are not doing any work in the camps, because as an organization, we do not believe people can have a dignified life in these camps, and if we want to help them, we should help them in the right way. And That is why, and you mentioned, but there are thousands who have immigrated too since the 2014 genocide. And Nadia worked, for example, with Canada to get them to agree to bring some Yazidi women survivors of sexual violence in their families. As I understand, hundreds of families have been brought to Canada because of the work that Nadia did with the government. Same arrangement after Nadia's visit to Australia, working with the Australian government. They have been taking Yazidis and especially survivors of sexual violence in their families. France did the same. Germany have taken survivors and their families. These are the main countries that have taken Yazidi women and children, especially survivors of sexual violence. But others immigrated on their own. I mean, took legal ways to get to Europe and to other places, often risking their lives. And I know people firsthand, family members that have died on trying to make it to Europe on their way in the agency and other places. They're all over the place at the moment because it's a shattered community, because that's what happens in the aftermath of genocide, and especially if you are abandoned about your own government and you are abandoned about the international community not responding in the right manner.
Yeah. Can you talk about the current political landscape? Do the Yazidi, do they want to be part of Iraq? Do they want self-governance, independence?
Well, to be honest with you, it's never been up to us to decide what part we want to be part of. As I mentioned, during different regimes, people have been brought in to control the region, to run the region. And after the region was liberated from ISIS, it has become more complicated because you not only now have the Kurdish government, the Iraqi government competing over the control of the region, you now have a non-state actor from the outside, the PKK. So you've got the PKK who have a presence in the region. You've got the KRG, the Iraqi government, and other militias in Iraq. All of these different groups are trying to control the region. And unless they, and by they I mean the Iraqi government, the Kurdish government, make some real progress in terms of finding a solution to stabilize the security and governance in Sinjar, the situation will continue to be dire for the community to return in.
I'm sensitive to your time here, but I just want to change gears and ask you about your role as a cultural advisor for the U.S. military. Can you speak about cross-cultural considerations in conflict, especially in conflict resolution and humanitarian crisis?
Yes, I worked for the military for about 5 years in Iraq. And before I get to your main question, to be honest with you, one of the issues that after the invasion, the focus of the international coalition led by the US was not for, they did not give much attention to like our region and similar regions that had minority groups in there. And from what I remember working and from my experience, that the focus was always let's focus on, well, there is insurgency, there is terrorist activities in X city and region, and we need to focus on that region, even in terms of like investment, in terms of security and everything, because it was a priority. Let's invest to reduce violence. Let's invest to reduce insurgency and terrorism. And for our region, obviously, the Yazidis as a community never joined any terrorist groups, never took part of any terrorist activities, and it was a stable region. And therefore, based on the priority that the coalition led by the US had was, there's no need to, it's not a priority. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes after the invasion, is that there was no plan to empower and support smaller communities. And when these forces, including the US and Australians and others, left Iraq, these communities, Yazidis and Christians and other smaller groups, became an easy target for ISIS and other groups. And I think, unfortunately, we are seeing the same pattern after ISIS was defeated and after the international coalition to defeat ISIS was created. Is that up until this day, that the training, the equipment of security forces is concentrated around certain areas. And, for example, the local police in Sinjar, I do not recall ever, after the liberation, has been equipped or trained by the coalition forces. So mostly the concentration and the priority is, other regions that have, Mosul and whatnot, other cities and regions that are priority for them. So I think this is a mistake, and in order to be able to equip and empower these communities to prevent future genocides and campaigns of violence. But in terms of culture, go back to your question. Yes, I think. Can you repeat what you mean about?
Just curious about any insights you'd have from having to interact with, U.S. troops and whatnots who are coming in and thrown into 45-degree weather and, into a whole different culture, and what sort of insights or anything you can speak to about, cross-cultural considerations, any pitfalls, anything they did that could have been improved upon, just anything at all.
Absolutely. So I think one of the things that should have been taken into consideration is to work with local communities, and they did. When I worked for them, they did. But what might have worked in one part, even of Nineveh, in Mosul, might not necessarily work in Sinjar, because they're two different religions, two different cultures, two different people. And I don't think that was taken into consideration, that they should have, the approach we're taking is, obviously it's not comparable as a small organization, but to work with community members, a bottom-up approach where you try to work with community members and empower them and make them a part of the process, so that whatever solutions and ideas you are proposing, working on, are sustainable, because they are created or co-created with community members, so that they last.
Right. The cultural component would be built in based on their participation.
Absolutely.
What can the international community do to help the Yazidis, governments, organizations, individuals? What can be done?
Well, I mean, individuals. Let's start with individuals. To be honest with you, we've been able to get a lot of work done because of support of individuals, in terms of getting our message across, sharing Nadia's story, the story of the Yazidi community, the story of other survivors, contributing in different ways they can, communicating about the plight of the Yazidis with their government representatives, urging them to do more and not to forget about something. Yes, it was 8 years ago, but we have not resolved it. So, that when it comes to individuals, but for the international community, especially speaking that, Canada and the US, and they can help, to be honest with you, without even having to allocate any more resources, any additional resources. One, invest in more political capital, and, using the leverage they have in different ways, that because they are involved in terms of economic and military aid and support to these different actors that I mentioned in the region that are involved and this dispute over Sinjar to leverage some of to use some of the leverage they have to pressure them and to make sure they respect the rights of Yazidis to return home and to have a say in their own security and governance. So it's a lot about just putting enough political capital into it and speaking out about human rights abuses against the community, but also directing some of the support they have to long-term sustainable solutions, but also to earmark. And it's important because if you allocate X amount of funds to help aid in Iraq and to help the displaced Iraqis and the displaced people in Iraq and to stabilization efforts, if it's not earmarked, I doubt that much of it will get to Sinjar because of different oversight mechanisms and different actors that are involved in everything that any government or UN agency does. It has to be coordinated with the Iraqi government and local authorities, and normally Sinjar is not a priority for them. And so earmarking certain funds when they make these decisions about how much they invest in Iraq would make it possible for not only earmarking it for the community, but also to be spent in the region in sustainable programs, not in temporary solutions in the camps. And the other is obviously, like I mentioned, with this so-called coalition to defeat ISIS, which is still present in Iraq and Syria, to use some of that leverage to stabilize the security and governance in Sinjar and to train local police from the community and equip them. But also, with this United Nations investigative team that has collected testimonies and evidence that is sitting somewhere at a UN office now in New York, and it's been 8 years. Why not use that evidence to put ISIS members, especially Canadian and US nationals that joined ISIS and took part in these crimes against Yazidis and joined ISIS? There are many things that the international community can do, but to be honest with you, the progress is very, very slow. Yeah. And it's been 8 years, and if things, the status quo continues, we are very worried about the future of the community in that region.
The complex in terms of picking up the pieces from the genocide and all the, short-term relief that's needed in building the services and whatnot, which you guys have been doing, but then the stabilization piece of the region, of the disputed region, which is essential too, right, for sustainable solutions. So, well, is there anything you want to touch upon before we wrap up? You've mentioned the website, nadiasinitiative.org, Nadia's book, and we'll get a link up to those. Anything to add?
No, thank you so much for this opportunity and for using your platform to talk about the plight of the Yazidis, and to your audience who is listening as well. Reading the book, The Lost Girl, is will give you. It's hard to in 1 hour to talk about all these different issues, and so reading the book will give you a good idea about the process that led to the genocide and also the way of life Yazidis describes it. Visiting the website is a good idea if you have time. Following Nadia's initiative on Twitter, Instagram, to also help us spread the message about the current situation and the developments, and also the work we are doing. Nadia's social media platforms, which she communicates about these different issues and even global issues at times. You can join us to communicate anything you want, anyone, and share with a friend your network about what happened and what is happening.
With that, thanks so much, Abid. I mean, it's difficult stuff to talk about. Thanks for sharing and educating about the Yazidi people and the struggle and what is being done and what can be done as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. If you want to hear more from international experts digging into a range of topics on conflict, power, and persuasion, subscribe to your favorite podcast app or visit us at cian.org. That's CIIAN.org.